It began with a fence, not a towering fortress or elaborate wall. Just a simple structure, 6 feet tall, clean cedar panels lined in straight perfection. It stood like a quiet promise of privacy, separating my yard from a pair of eyes that never seemed to blink. My neighbor, Linda, was the definition of suburban control. Perfect hedges, manicured lawn, and an ever-present smirk that said she knew what everyone else was doing even before they did. She thrived on gossip and surveillance, a self-appointed security camera disguised as a person. Every stray noise, every strange car, every porch light left on too long. She noticed it all. When I first moved to Willow Creek Estates, I tried to be nice. I mowed regularly, kept the peace, smiled on garbage days. But Linda didn't want neighbors. She wanted subordinates, the kind who apologized for their trash cans touching hers, or who moved patio furniture because it ruined her sightline. So when I finally decided to build a fence, something I'd planned for months, I knew it wouldn't sit well with her. I told myself it didn't matter. It was my property, my money, my right. But I underestimated how far some people will go when control slips through their fingers. The first complaints started before the cement even dried. She showed up at the curb while my contractor was unloading wood. Arms crossed, lips pursed, scanning blueprints she wasn't supposed to have. She claimed it violated community uniformity and disrupted property harmony. Phrases straight out of the HOA handbook she probably slept with on her nightstand. The truth was far simpler. She didn't like not being able to see into my yard anymore. By the next morning, she'd filed a formal grievance. A typed letter, printed on HOA stationery, slipped under my door before sunrise. It accused me of erecting an unauthorized barrier exceeding height limitations. 6 feet, they said, was too tall. Still, I ignored it. The state code clearly allowed it. The HOA guidelines said fences could be 6 feet tall subject to standard topography. My yard sloped downward slightly, meaning the top edge peaked higher from her side than mine. That was all. But Linda didn't see reason. Each day, like clockwork, she found new excuses to wander near the fence, pretending to trim her hedges, pretending to inspect weeds, pretending not to stare. And then came the escalation. 2 weeks later, I came home to find an envelope on my porch, stamped violation notice. The HOA was demanding the immediate removal or modification of my fence. Noncompliance, they warned, would result in daily fines and potential legal enforcement. They even attached photo evidence showing my fence towering ominously behind her yard. I laughed at first. The photo was angled from her property, shot low from her flower bed, tilted to exaggerate the height. It looked like a fortress, but I knew better. Still, it stung. I spent hours researching, combing through municipal codes, HOA regulations, and court precedents from other neighborhoods. Every source confirmed the same thing. Nothing was wrong. I even called a local inspector who came out, tape measure in hand, and documented the fence was legal, precisely 6 feet, no higher. But Linda wasn't satisfied with facts. 3 days later, at dawn, the flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser spilled across my driveway. I stepped outside to find her standing proudly on her lawn, gesturing at my fence with exaggerated distress. She'd called the cops. She told them I was building a hazardous, non-compliant structure. She claimed it was restricting visibility and detracting from the neighborhood's architectural tone. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The officer's expression said the same. He measured, took notes, and politely told her that my fence wasn't a criminal matter. It was an HOA issue. Then he left. She stood there fuming as his car disappeared, her face twisted into the kind of smile that hides rage you can't control. And so it began. Her campaign, my battle, and the war that would turn this quiet cul-de-sac into the center of a scandal that ended in HOA and changed everything about how far a Karen can go before the law fights back. Because it wasn't just about a fence anymore. It was about power. And I just built the one thing she couldn't climb over. The police visit should have been the end of it. A single conversation, a calm explanation, and everyone would move on. But Linda didn't want it to end. She wanted revenge cloaked in regulation. By the next morning, the battle escalated. My mailbox overflowed with notices, official-looking letters printed in the HOA's stark blue ink. Each one echoed the same carefully worded condemnation: failure to comply with neighborhood visual harmony codes. Another cited unauthorized modification to property boundary structures. And a third, my personal favorite, accused me of disrupting aesthetic continuity. It was laughable at first, the absurdity of it all, until the fines started stacking. $25 a day, then $50, then a threat that failure to pay could result in liens upon property and forfeiture of community privileges. For what? For daring to own a fence that blocked their self-appointed warden's view into my yard. Every day, Linda strutted past, clipboard in hand, pretending to inspect for further violations. She wasn't subtle. She'd pause near the fence, whisper into her phone, then wave at other neighbors like a patrol commander rallying troops. And that's when I learned just how deep her connections ran. She wasn't just a nosy neighbor. She was a former HOA vice president, forced out years ago after a budget dispute, but still obsessively tied to her lost authority. She'd placed herself on every unofficial committee she could find, from landscaping to event planning. The HOA president, an overworked man who just wanted peace, had grown dependent on her for policy enforcement, meaning every email, every complaint, every photo submission of concern passed right through her hands. It explained everything: the speed of the citations, the constant fines, the HOA board's indifference when I called. They were afraid of her too. But while the HOA relied on her word, I relied on evidence. I began documenting everything: dates, letters, photos, phone records. I even bought a second camera facing her property line, knowing she'd eventually slip up. She was too convinced she was untouchable to realize how predictable she'd become. Sure enough, within a week, she gave me what I needed. It started when I caught her leaning over the fence one morning, cell phone camera out, snapping angles that exaggerated the fence's height. Minutes later, she emailed those same photos to the board, demanding an emergency inspection. What she didn't realize was that my footage from the other side of the yard captured her manipulation. The camera tilt, the forced perspective, the rehearsed dramatics. I saved everything, but that wasn't enough for her. She needed escalation, so she went door to door, spinning her story. She told everyone I was building without safety clearance, that my fence might fall during strong winds, that it could harm children playing nearby. Every accusation was meticulous, rehearsed, and ridiculous. Some neighbors believed her or simply didn't want conflict. Others started reaching out to me quietly, whispering that they knew she was lying but couldn't afford her attention. I became the subject of a small-town smear campaign, and yet, I'd never felt calmer, because the more she pointed, the more proof I collected. Her emails became my ammunition. Her arrogance became my advantage. Every baseless letter, every model code violation she fabricated, I copied, timestamped, archived. And then came her biggest mistake. One afternoon, I received a new notice. It stated that an HOA surveyor had reevaluated property lines and confirmed encroachment beyond legal bounds. That was impossible. My fence was built exactly 1 inch inside my recorded boundary. But curiosity turned to fury when I checked the attachment. The evidence photo was a crude digital edit, photoshopped, showing my fence overlapping her side of the property by nearly a foot. The timestamp had been altered. The name attached to the file? An HOA email address created just 3 days earlier. And the sender? Linda herself. That was the moment everything changed. The calm I'd been holding on to broke, not in anger, but in clarity. She'd crossed from harassment into criminal falsification. I wasn't fighting rules anymore. I was fighting a fraud. That night, I compiled my entire timeline. Vendor receipts, permit documentation, video footage, the altered image, all neatly organized in a single digital folder labeled Fencegate. I didn't post it online. Not yet. I sent it to someone better. The City Zoning Commission. Because if Linda wanted to wage war with paper trails, I was about to show her what an evidence avalanche looked like. The next morning, I watched her stroll past again, clipboard in hand, confident she'd buried me under her lies. She didn't know that she'd already lost. Because once the city got involved, her empire of fake authority would start to crack. And when that happened, everyone in Willow Creek would see exactly what she really was. The HOA queen was about to meet the law. When the city got involved, everything changed. Started quietly, almost too quietly. The zoning department sent a single letter confirming an inquiry into property boundary complaints between adjacent residents of Willow Creek Estates. To anyone else, it would have looked routine. But to Linda, it was a trigger. For the first time, someone other than her was in charge. Within a week, a sharp-looking city inspector showed up with a clipboard, measuring tools, and a drone camera. It was official, far more official than any of Linda's handwritten violation forms. He moved through the property methodically, taking photos, measuring clearances, documenting everything with sterile precision. Linda, of course, made herself available. She stood outside her yard waiting for him, pretending to assist the process, showering the poor man with decades of HOA trivia and faux legal terminology. She must have thought she could charm or intimidate him. But he wasn't there for HOA gossip. He was there for facts. When he finished measuring the fence, he didn't say much. He thanked both of us and promised a written report within 10 business days. I nodded politely while Linda forced a smile. But I could see that beneath her calm facade, she was starting to panic. 10 business days later, her panic turned to silence. Because the report arrived. And it was devastating for her. The document confirmed 3 things. 1, the fence complied fully with city code. 2, the HOA guidelines Linda had cited were outdated and never officially re-registered after a bylaw revision years ago. And 3, the photo evidence submitted by Linda and signed under digital affidavit showed clear signs of tampering. In legal terms, she'd falsified documentation submitted to a governing body. The words potential fraud jumped off the page like a headline from a paper destined to ruin her reputation. When the board received the city's findings, panic spread through the HOA like a virus. They called an emergency meeting to discuss the breach of authority and misconduct of administrative representatives. But this time, the community was paying attention. People wanted answers. They wanted transparency. By the time I arrived at that meeting, the room was overflowing. Neighbors filled chairs, stood along the walls, spilling into the hallway. There was no whispering anymore, just murmurs of anger and disbelief, because none of this was really about offense anymore. It was about all the little ways Linda had manipulated their lives for years. The unjust warnings, the petty fines, the power trips disguised as policies. And now, her credibility was disintegrating in real time. The HOA president opened the meeting with shaking hands, reading statements he clearly hadn't prepared for. Then came the part everyone waited for, the city's summary. When he read the report aloud, the findings, the evidence, the mention of falsified photos, the room erupted. Neighbors gasped, muttered, even shouted. Linda, sitting 3 rows back, stared straight ahead, motionless. Her perfect composure, her polished control, gone. For once, she had no words. That night marked the beginning of her unraveling. Emails leaked. Ones where she'd mocked residents who questioned her rules, where she bragged about keeping the neighborhood in line. The HOA's database showed she'd filed over 80 complaints personally, most directed at families with small children or younger homeowners she assumed didn't belong there. Everything she built on fear came back to mock her. The city's next step was swift. They issued a formal reprimand to the HOA for failure to follow procedural standards. The board suspended all enforcement actions pending reorganization. Translation: they were frozen. They couldn't fine anyone, cite anyone, or approve even the smallest appearance violations. The neighborhood finally exhaled. For years, the HOA had been a silent dictatorship where people paid dues just to avoid being targeted. But now the spell was broken. The illusion of power shattered the moment truth entered the equation. And Linda? She couldn't bear it. She spent days pacing her yard, phone glued to her ear, whispering to whoever would still listen. She filed appeals with the city, all denied. She sent letters to the HOA, ignored. And when her fabricated influence vanished completely, she turned bitter, cutting glares at neighbors who now dared to wave at me, glancing away from houses she could no longer control. But the story wasn't over yet, because the city report, as thorough as it was, opened one final door: the discovery that Linda's actions weren't just harassment. They were criminal. The falsified evidence she'd submitted was officially logged in a city database, meaning she'd signed false statements under penalty of perjury. It was no longer a neighborhood squabble. It was a case. And when local news outlets got hold of that detail, the cameras came next. Every reporter wanted the same footage. The infamous fence war that exposed what happens when unchecked power exploits authority. Linda had wanted attention once. Now she had more than she could handle. By the end of that week, she wasn't just the neighbor next door. She was a headline. And for me, all it took was the truth. A fence built legally and a patience built through endurance, to watch years of her control collapse beneath the weight of her own lies. But as her downfall went public, something unexpected happened. The neighborhood began to change. People who once stayed quiet started reclaiming their voices. And what came next would reshape not only Willow Creek, but every HOA in the county. Because Linda had built her empire on fear, and fear had finally met its end. News travels fast when a scandal has a name, a face, and a fence. Within 48 hours of the city's official report becoming public record, the story of the fence feud at Willow Creek swept across local news channels like wildfire. What started as a quiet neighborhood dispute between two suburban homeowners suddenly had all the drama of a primetime exposé. The details spread like gossip wrapped in justice. HOA member falsifies evidence in fence complaint. It was a headline that no one could ignore. Even people outside our town followed the story, leaving thousands of comments online defending the homeowner's right to privacy. For a community built on fear of confrontation, it was surreal to see strangers standing beside us. Linda had spent years cultivating her reputation as Willow Creek's protector, the overseer who kept everyone in line. But overnight, that reputation unraveled. Her face appeared in screenshots, her name cited in articles, her actions dissected on forums. People online called her the Wall Watcher, Fence Karen, even the HOA Queen gone rogue. Meanwhile, residents of Willow Creek who had once tiptoed around her were finally laughing out loud. Fear had turned to relief, and relief gave way to something stronger: solidarity. Then came the board's reckoning. Under immense public pressure, the HOA called a mandatory town meeting for the first time in its history. No polished couches or private discussions this time. Just a crowded community center full of frustrated homeowners, angry voices, and local reporters waiting to see whether the board would implode or reform. Linda didn't attend. She couldn't. The investigative committee had barred her from participating in any HOA-related activity pending review of misconduct. But her shadow loomed heavy in that hall, carried in whispered jokes and knowing glances. The board's president stood shaken behind the podium, reading nervously from a prepared statement. He admitted that administrative responsibilities had been mishandled. He acknowledged that complaints had been enforced using unverified reports. And finally, he confirmed what everyone already knew: Linda's fabricated evidence and coercive tactics had violated state law. When those words left his mouth, the room erupted. People clapped, shouted, some even cried. It wasn't gloating, it was liberation. For the first time, no one feared retaliation. The veneer of control that had governed every inch of Willow Creek crumbled into dust. The press recorded every moment. Homeowners speaking up about the fines, the harassment, the endless compliance emails that had ruled their lives. A single father confessed how he'd been fined for leaving a bicycle on his porch overnight. An elderly widow admitted that Linda had threatened her with a property violation because of her wheelchair ramp. These weren't minor grievances anymore. They were stories of quiet suffering, finally given voice. By the end of the meeting, a unanimous vote was cast. The HOA board would dissolve pending reformation. Every policy would be reviewed. Every complaint would be reevaluated. Every fine issued under Linda's influence would be refunded. That vote was the death toll of an empire built on gossip, fear, and empty authority. As the cameras flashed, I stepped outside into the cool night air and looked toward my fence. It stood quietly beneath the streetlight, still solid, still mine. The symbol of everything she had tried to destroy. A few neighbors joined me. For once, we weren't whispering about policies or violations. We were genuinely talking about gardens, kids, cookouts, things neighbors were meant to talk about. In the following weeks, Willow Creek looked different. Not physically, the houses were still uniform, the hedges still cut straight, but in energy. Doors stayed open longer, laughter returned, and the invisible tension that once hung over each lawn was gone. And Linda? She tried to disappear, but the internet had long memories. Clips of her false statements were shared on social media. Her behavior dissected on HOA commentary channels. What she'd done became a cautionary tale about control, deception, and the absurd lengths some people will go just to feel powerful. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But every time I remembered the fear she'd instilled in others, or the tears people shed over her fabricated finds, that sympathy faded. In the end, Linda's obsession with authority gave us the courage to take ours back. Her desperation to rule had forced us to learn what community really meant. The city council later reached out to me, asking if I'd be willing to share my documentation as part of a new initiative, one aimed at reforming how HOAs operate across the county. I didn't hesitate. I sent everything. Linda's fence battle had evolved into something far bigger, the start of a movement. But change always invites resistance, and while Willow Creek was finally free, not everyone wanted to accept accountability. A new twist was coming, one that would test how strong our newfound unity really was. Because Linda wasn't done yet. She still had one last card left to play. For a brief moment, peace returned to Willow Creek. The fences no longer divided neighbors. They defined boundaries that everyone finally respected. The HOA was gone. The fear had faded, and people started to reclaim their community with pride. But beneath that calm, a whisper traveled like static. Linda wasn't finished. She'd been silent for weeks. No emails, no phone calls, no sudden visits to check property conditions. Most assumed she'd surrendered, maybe even moved away. Yet those who knew her best said something different. They said Linda never lost quietly. And they were right. A month after the HOA disbanded, thick envelopes appeared in several mailboxes, each bearing the same embossed seal, Willow Creek Estates legal representation. Inside was a formal notice, a private lawsuit filed by Linda Marie Perkins against me, the city commission, and the former HOA board members. Her claim? Defamation, harassment, and property devaluation caused by unlawful interference. It was classic Karen. Rewriting history, painting herself as the victim of her own downfall. Neighbors gathered that evening in my garage, spreading the letters across a workbench like pieces of a trap we were all caught in. The signatures were real, the accusations broad. She was demanding damages, claiming my fence, and the publicity surrounding it, had destroyed her peace of enjoyment. Nobody was afraid this time. Anger replaced fear. People lined up to testify on behalf of the truth. The same residents she'd bullied had receipts, screenshots, and copies of the same fake violation letters she'd used to terrorize them. Still, she tried to spin it. When the court date arrived, she walked in with her head high, clutching a stack of binders stuffed with color-coded evidence. But her arrogance met a wall of simple, absolute facts. The judge reviewed the chain of documents, starting with the city's audit, the one that proved her photos were falsified. Then came the video footage I'd kept, showing her leaning over the fence, taking those exaggerated angle shots, and emailing them minutes later to the board. Every defense she offered crumbled. Her lawyer's tone shifted from confident to strained as each witness spoke. Residents described how she stalked their yards, called the police on harmless gatherings, and used fear to push personal grudges through HOA bureaucracy. It wasn't just unprofessional, it was predatory. And through it all, I said very little. I didn't have to. My fence, that quiet wall she had tried so hard to destroy, spoke louder than any angry word could. It had stood untouched this entire time. Legal, strong, unmoved. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom was silent except for the judge's voice. He dismissed her claims as baseless and ordered her to pay restitution for filing fraudulent documents during the city's investigation. It wasn't jail time, but it was humiliation and financial ruin. For the first time in years, her power was truly gone. Afterward, the town moved quickly. The HOA, or what remained of it, officially dissolved under a new community charter. A neighborhood council took its place, a transparent system run by volunteers, free from ego or politics. Rules were simplified, votes public, and voices equally valued. The change didn't erase the scars, but it healed them honestly. No one forgot how we'd gotten there. Linda sold her house 2 months later, leaving behind only gossip and chipped paint where her cameras used to be mounted. She disappeared from town records entirely, replaced by a quiet family who planted flowers where her motion lights once blazed. When I looked out my window that spring, my fence stood against the blooming azaleas, the same fence she called an eyesore. But now it framed a neighborhood that had grown stronger, kinder, freer. One evening, as the sun caught the polished cedar panels, I thought about the irony. She'd built an empire out of control. I'd built a fence out of necessity. And in the end, my fence held up better than her ego ever could. That week, a small article appeared in a local paper. It read, "Local HOA disputes spark countywide reform." The county commissioner credited our case as the origin for new policy guidelines ensuring resident oversight of every HOA action from here on out. Linda had tried to use the system to silence those who challenged her. Instead, she became the reason the system changed. Her downfall wasn't just personal, it became symbolic. Willow Creek had gone from one of the most controlled neighborhoods in the city to one of the most democratic. The HOA curse that had haunted it for decades had ended, all because one woman tried to make a fence illegal. As I sat on my porch that night, watching kids play under the same warm light that used to feel like surveillance, I realized something simple but powerful. Sometimes, change doesn't start with rebellion. It starts with boundaries, real ones, the kind you build not to shut people out, but to remind them that respect must go both ways. That's what my fence was. A lesson carved in boards and bolts, standing quietly long after the war ended. And though the headlines eventually faded, every person who passed by it saw more than wood and nails. They saw proof that one act of defiance, backed by truth, can topple even the tallest tower of control.